Yuki Tanaka had never seen a Coca-Cola bottle before the day an American Marine placed one in front of her. She stared at it like it was a weapon. In a way it was, because what happened when she finally took a sip would shatter everything she had been taught about her enemy and about herself. But that moment was still 3 days away. And in those 3 days, Yuki would have to survive the most terrifying experience of her young life, confront everything she believed about honor and death, and make a choice that would haunt her for the next 40 years. This is the story of what happened when fear met mercy on a Pacific island in the final days of World War II, and it begins in darkness. August 1945. Saipan Island, a collapsed storehouse on the edge of a village that no longer existed. 15 women and children huddled in the shadows pressed against wooden walls that still smelled faintly of dried fish and mildew. The air was thick, suffocating. Someone's breath came too fast, panicked. A child whimpered and was immediately hushed by a trembling hand over her mouth. Yuki sat with her back against the wall, her 14-year-old sister Emiko sleeping fitfully against her shoulder. The girl's breathing was shallow, interrupted by small catches that might have been the beginning of sound. Yuki kept one arm wrapped around her sister's thin frame. With the other hand, she gripped something small and cold, a knife. Mrs. Kimura, the eldest woman, had pressed it into her palm an hour earlier, insisting all the young women carry one, when the sounds of boots and foreign voices first echoed through the ruined village. The older woman's hands had been shaking so badly that the blade nearly cut Yuki's fingers as it was transferred. "Yuki-chan," her mother had whispered, her voice breaking on the familiar name. "If they touch you, you know what honor demands." Yuki had nodded in the darkness. She had known what her mother meant without needing to hear the words spoken aloud. They had all been taught. Death was better than dishonor. Death was better than what the Americans would do. But now, sitting in the darkness with her sister's weight against her shoulder, Yuki felt something she had never admitted to anyone. A question that twisted in her gut like hunger. Does honor really demand death, or does fear? She had no answer, and in 3 hours, American Marines would enter that storehouse. Yuki expected death or worse. What she got instead would take her 40 years to fully understand. But first, we need to go back. To understand what happened in that storehouse, you need to understand what brought Yuki there. You need to understand the world that taught an 18-year-old girl that death was preferable to mercy, that enemies were monsters, and that courage meant knowing when to die. You need to understand the machine that created her fear. 3 days earlier, and 3,000 miles away, a man sat by candlelight in a tent that smelled of gun oil and sweat. His name was Michael O'Brien. His friends called him Mike, and he was writing a letter he hoped his mother would never have to read. The candlelight flickered across the page as Mike's hand moved slowly, carefully. He was 26 years old. He had been in the Pacific for 2 years. Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and now Saipan, where the fighting had finally stopped, but the war had not quite ended. Tomorrow they had been told they would be taking civilian prisoners, women and children mostly, stragglers who had been hiding in the jungle and caves, too terrified to surrender, too weak to keep running. Mike stared at the page for a long time before he continued writing. "Mama," he wrote, "they told us today we will be taking civilian prisoners tomorrow. Women and children mostly. I keep thinking about Sarah." He paused. The name sat heavy on the page. Sarah, his sister. 3 years since Pearl Harbor, and it still felt like yesterday. "I know I don't talk about her much," he continued. 3 years since Pearl Harbor, and it still feels like yesterday. She was on that hospital ship, Mama, the USS Solace. She was trying to save lives when the bombs fell. She was always trying to save lives. Mike set down the pen and reached into his brace pocket. He pulled out a small photograph, creased and worn from being carried close to his heart for 3 years. Sarah in her Navy nurse uniform, smiling that smile that could light up a room. 23 years old in the photo. She would never be older. "Tomorrow I am going to see Japanese mothers and daughters," Mike wrote, "and I am going to have to look them in the eye knowing what their countrymen did to my sister. Captain says we treat them with dignity, says that is what separates us from the enemy, that we do not become what we fight." His hand shook slightly as he wrote the next line. "I do not know if I can do it, Mama, but I am going to try, because Sarah would want me to also. She always said hate poisons the hater more than the hated. I am about to find out if she was right." He signed the letter, folded it carefully, and placed it in an envelope he hoped would never need to be mailed. Then he touched the photograph of his sister one more time before tucking it back into his pocket close to his heart, where it had lived for 3 years. Outside the tent, the Pacific night was warm and thick with the sound of insects. Somewhere in the darkness, women and children were hiding, terrified of the men who would find them in the morning. And one of those men carried the photo of a sister who had died saving lives, trying to figure out how to honor her memory by showing mercy to her enemies. But Yuki knew nothing of this man or his dead sister or his struggle. 6 months earlier, her world had been very different. The shop had been small but proud, tucked into a corner of Garapan village where the street curved toward the harbor. Tanaka family tailoring, the sign had read. Inside, the air always smelled of fresh cut fabric and the oil her father used on the old Singer sewing machine that had belonged to his father. Yuki could still hear it sometimes in her memory, that rhythmic sound, click, clack, click, clack, the needle driving through fabric in perfect time, her mother's foot working the pedal with practiced ease. Her father had taught both of his daughters to sew, even though Emiko had been too young to manage anything more complicated than a straight seam. Press the needle like this, her father had said, his large hands guiding Emiko's small ones. Not too hard, gentle. You are not fighting the fabric. You are making friends with it. Emiko had giggled at that, making friends with fabric. Their father had always said strange, wonderful things like that. He had been a gentle man, soft-spoken and kind. Yuki had never once heard him raise his voice, not even when a customer complained or when money was tight. There had been a day, Yuki remembered, when they had all worked together to make a new work shirt for her father. His old one had become threadbare at the elbows, and her mother had insisted. Emiko had been allowed to do the collar, the simplest part, and she had been so proud when it was finished. She had sung while she worked an old folk song about cranes flying home. That had been 6 months ago. The shop was gone now. The building had been reduced to blackened timber and ash in a bombing raid. Her father was gone too, drafted into a civilian labor battalion, killed 2 weeks later when American planes had struck the convoy. His body had never been recovered. And the world that Yuki had known, the world of singers, sewing machines, and folk songs about cranes, had been replaced by something else entirely. It had started with the posters. They appeared overnight, plastered on every wall and storefront that still stood in the village. Garish colors, crude drawings. American soldiers drawn with exaggerated features. Devil horns sprouting from their helmets, fangs dripping blood. Women cowering beneath them, children torn from their mothers' arms. The American beasts, the text declared in bold characters, show no mercy. They will violate every woman they capture. They will torture every child. Death is the only honor. Yuki had stood in front of one of these posters outside what remained of the family shop, her sister's hand in hers. Emiko had stared up at the grotesque image, her eyes wide. "Unti-chan," she had whispered, using the familiar term for older sister. "Are they really devils?" Yuki had looked down at her sister's frightened face. She was 14 years old, still young enough to believe in monsters, still young enough to think that devils might be real. "I don't know," Yuki had answered honestly. "I have never seen one." But the posters were only the beginning. The radio broadcast came next, crackling through the speakers of the community center, where the remaining villagers gathered for news and rations. A man's voice, sharp and insistent, describing in graphic detail what American soldiers did to captured women. The voice painted pictures with words, terrible pictures that made the women in the room look away from each other in shame and fear. And then came the soldiers themselves, not Americans, Japanese. Retreating soldiers, haggard and hollow-eyed, passing through the village on their way to nowhere. They stopped to rest, to eat what little food the villagers could spare, and to tell stories. "They are animals," one soldier had said, his voice flat with exhaustion or trauma or both. "They take the women first, the young ones. They line them up and take turns. I saw it with my own eyes." He had not seen it with his own eyes. The story was a lie, part of the great machinery of fear that the Japanese military had built to keep civilians from surrendering. But Yuki did not know that. She only knew that a soldier, a man who had been there, who had fought them, was telling her that capture meant something worse than death. The machinery ground on, relentless. 3 months before the Americans arrived, there had been an assembly. Every woman and girl in the village, or what remained of the village, had been ordered to the community center. They sat on the floor, crowded together, while a military officer stood at the front. Lieutenant Suzuki, That was his name. Yuki would remember it forever. He had a scar that ran from his left eye to his jaw, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. He showed them photographs. Or what he claimed were photographs. Images of women bloodied and broken that he said were victims of American soldiers. The images were grainy, difficult to make out clearly, but the implication was unmistakable. "This is what awaits you," Lieutenant Suzuki had said, his scarred face immobile. "The Americans are not human, they are beasts. They do not understand honor or mercy. To them you are nothing but objects to be used and discarded." He had demonstrated then with clinical precision how a woman should end her own life if capture became inevitable. A quick slash across the throat here, just below the jaw. Fast, efficient, honorable. "You carry the nation's honor between your legs," he had said, and several women had gasped at the crudeness of it, the shocking directness. "Do not let the beast defile it. Death is your duty. Death is your dignity." Before they left, each woman had been given a small cloth pouch. Inside was a cyanide capsule, just in case the knife was too difficult, just in case courage failed. Yuki had sat in the back of that assembly, her sister beside her, feeling the weight of the capsule in her hand. It was surprisingly heavy for something so small. The weight of duty, the weight of honor, the weight of expected death. But there had been another woman sitting in the back of the room, an older woman, perhaps in her early 50s, with silver threading through her black hair. Her name was Hana Watanabe. She was a widow, her husband dead 5 years earlier, her 2 sons killed in action on distant islands, whose names she could barely pronounce. When the assembly ended and the women filed out into the harsh sunlight, Hana had caught Yuki's eye. Just a glance, but there had been something in it, something that was not quite belief, not quite acceptance. Later in the shadows between 2 buildings, Hana had approached her. "Child," she had said softly, "may I speak with you?" Yuki had nodded, wary but curious. "My grandmother," Hana had said, "was a hidden Christian. Kakure Kirishitan they were called. In Nagasaki, when the government hunted Christians, my family kept the faith in secret. My grandmother told me stories about those days, about persecution, about propaganda, about how the government said Christians were evil, that they served foreign devils, that they would destroy Japan." She had paused, her eyes distant with memory. "My grandmother taught me something important, Yuki-chan. She said, judge people by their actions toward the helpless. When you are helpless, you see true character. Not propaganda, not speeches, actions." Yuki had not known what to say. The words felt dangerous, like sedition. "I am not saying the soldiers lie," Hana had continued carefully. "I am only saying wait and see. If the Americans come, watch what they do. Not what we have been told they will do, what they actually do." Then she had reached into her sleeve and pulled out something that made Yuki's breath catch. A rosary. Wooden beads worn smooth with use strung on a faded cord. Her grandmother's rosary, hidden and preserved through decades of persecution. "I will pray," Hana had said. "If there is a God of mercy, perhaps he watches even in war. But I will not pray for death. I will pray for wisdom to know when to fight and when to surrender." Yuki had felt anger then, hot and sudden. "You would surrender after what they did to our fathers, our brothers." "Child," Hana had said gently, "I would live. There is no honor in needless death. But I understand if you choose differently. We each must decide." The conversation had ended there, but the words had stayed with Yuki. Even as the situation grew more desperate, even as the American bombardment intensified, even as fear became the only constant in her shrinking world, those words remained. Wait and see. Watch what they do. The final days had been hell. The naval bombardment came first. Great shells arcing through the air to explode among the ruins of the village, shaking the earth so hard that teeth rattled in skulls. The sound was enormous beyond anything Yuki had imagined sound could be. It did not just fill the ears. It filled the chest, the stomach, the bones. They had fled to the jungle, what remained of the village population. Mothers carrying children on their backs. Old people supported by younger relatives, everyone moving in a stumbling exodus toward the interior of the island, where the caves were, where perhaps the bombs could not reach. Yuki's family had found shelter in one of these caves. The stone was damp and cold, and the air tasted like minerals and fear. They had no food. The supplies they had managed to carry had run out after 3 days, and there was nothing to forage. The jungle had been stripped bare by other desperate refugees. Emiko had cried from hunger, her small stomach cramping painfully. She would curl up in the ball, her arms wrapped around her middle, and rock back and forth, making small sounds of distress. Yuki would hold her sister and feel utterly helpless. An elderly woman in the cave had grown desperate. One night when she thought others were asleep, she whispered about how perhaps it would be better if families went together. Cleanly, before the hunger got worse. Yuki heard this and held Emiko tighter, knowing she would never choose that path. Cleanly, before the hunger got worse, before the Americans came. But their father was already dead by then, killed in the bombing 2 weeks earlier. Their mother had been whispering to a memory, to an absence, and when Yuki realized this, she had felt something break inside herself. On the 7th day in the caves, they heard sounds. Not bombs this time. Gunfire, but scattered, sporadic. And voices. Foreign voices, calling out in a language that sounded harsh and strange. The Americans had come. The refugees scattered deeper into the jungle, but there was nowhere left to run. The island was not large. The Americans were everywhere, and the refugees were weak, sick, starving. Some chose the blade. Yuki heard the screams in the night, knew what they meant. Entire families going together into the darkness. She tried to cover Emiko's ears, but the sounds carried through the jungle like accusations. A few elderly men tried to surrender. They came back with stories that they had been shot immediately, that the Americans showed no mercy, even to the old and weak. These were lies born of misunderstanding or deliberate deception by officers who wanted to prevent surrender, but Yuki believed them. Everyone believed them. On the 9th day, 15 women and children, all that remained of a group that had once been 50, found shelter in an abandoned storehouse at the edge of what had been Garapan village. The building was half collapsed, but it had walls and a roof of sorts. They could hide there, wait, hope that somehow the Americans would pass them by. They took turns keeping watch through cracks in the walls. They whispered prayers. They clutched their knives and their capsules and waited for the inevitable. On the 2nd night in the storehouse, Emiko had asked Yuki a question that broke her heart. "Oni-chan," the girl had whispered, "will heaven have needles and thread?" Yuki had turned to look at her sister in the darkness. "Why do you ask?" "So I can finish my embroidery." "The crane. I never got to finish the crane Papa taught me." Yuki had wept then silently, her tears hot on her cheeks. She had held her sister and wept for the world that had taught a 14-year-old girl to think about sewing supplies in heaven, to accept death so completely that she worried about unfinished embroidery. That night, as the others slept or pretended to sleep, Yuki had made a decision. She would not let Emiko die if there was any chance at all, to keep her alive. Even if that chance meant surrender. Even if it meant dishonor. She did not tell anyone about this decision. She especially did not tell her mother, who had pressed the knife into her hand and whispered about honor. But the decision was made, and once made, it could not be unmade. The next morning they heard the boots. The sound came from multiple directions. Heavy boots on gravel and broken stone. American boots. The women in the storehouse froze, every eye wide, every breath held. Commands in English echoed across the ruined village. Sharp, clipped words that meant nothing to Yuki but carried the unmistakable tone of military orders. The women huddled together instinctively. Mothers pulled children close. Older women clutched younger ones. They pressed against the back wall of the storehouse as if they could melt into the wood and disappear. Yuki positioned herself in front of Emiko. The knife was under her kimono, the blade cold against her skin. Her hand trembled as she gripped it. Her mother began to chant, softly at first, then louder. Namu Amida Butsu, Namu Amida Butsu, the Buddhist death prayer. Others joined her, their voices rising in a chorus of final devotions. The boots came closer, crunching on debris, multiple sets, moving with purpose. The women could see shadows through the cracks in the walls, now dark shapes moving past. Then the shadows stopped. Right outside the door, a voice called out something in English. A command or a question, impossible to tell. No one answered. What could they answer? The voice repeated louder this time. Still silence from inside the storehouse, except for the whispered prayers and the sound of children trying not to cry. The door rattled. Someone was trying the handle from outside. Then the door swung open. Sunlight flooded in, blinding after days in the dim interior. For a moment, all Yuki could see was light and a dark silhouette filling the doorway. A tall figure, broad shoulders, something in his hands that could only be a rifle. The women screamed. Some pressed harder against the wall. One woman fainted. Children wailed in terror. The figure stepped into the storehouse, and as Yuki's eyes adjusted, she saw him clearly. An American Marine, tall over 6 feet, helmet low over his eyes, rifle held across his chest. Behind him, more Marines fanning out across what remained of the village square. This was the moment they had been taught to fear, the moment when the beasts would reveal themselves. Yuki's hand tightened on the knife. She pulled Emiko closer, preparing for what had to be done. But the Marine did not advance. He stood just inside the doorway, and he did something Yuki had not expected. He lowered his rifle. Then he raised both hands, palms forward, empty. No weapon, no threat, just open hands. He said something in English. The tone was not harsh, not commanding, almost gentle. Behind him, another voice, younger, called out, and then words in Japanese, accented, uncertain but Japanese. Anata tachi wa horyo desu, gai wa kuwaimasen, tabemono to mizu wo agamasu. You are prisoners. You will not be harmed. We will give you food and water. The women stared in stunned silence. This was not what they had been told would happen. This was not the script they had been given. The tall Marine turned and said something to his men behind him. They lowered their rifles as well, all of them. And then incredibly, they took a step back, away from the door, away from the women. No one moved, no one breathed. The Marine said something else, and a younger soldier, Asian features visible even under his helmet, stepped forward. He repeated the Japanese words, "We will not harm you. We will give you food and water. Please stay together." Then the tall Marine reached into a pack on his belt and pulled out something, a canteen. He unscrewed the cap, slowly making sure everyone could see what he was doing. Then he tipped it and water poured out onto the ground. Clean water, clear and bright in the morning sun. He held the canteen up, pointed to it, then gestured toward the women. "For you," the young translator said in Japanese. "Water, clean, free." Still no one moved. The Marine handed the canteen to the translator, who walked forward slowly, very slowly, his hands visible at all times. He set the canteen on the ground about 5 paces from the nearest woman. Then he backed away immediately, hands still visible. The Marine pointed to the canteen again, made a drinking motion with his hand, and then they waited. The tall Marine did not look impatient. He did not look angry. He simply stood there, rifle lowered, hands open, waiting. The other Marines behind him did the same. 5 of them, all with lowered weapons, all standing still. The silence stretched out, broken only by the sound of children crying softly and someone's panicked breathing. Then Emiko whispered, her voice barely audible, "I'm so thirsty, Oni-chan." Yuki looked down at her sister. Emiko's lips were cracked, her eyes sunken. How long had it been since she had clean water to drink? Yuki looked back at the Marines. The tall one was watching her, she realized. Not in a threatening way, just watching. Waiting to see what she would do. This was the moment. The choice, death and honor as she had been taught. Or the risk of life, the risk of shame, the risk of believing that maybe, just maybe, the propaganda had lied. She thought about her father, about his last words. Courage isn't just dying for honor. Sometimes it's living for love. She thought about Hana's words. Watch what they do. Not what we have been told they will do, what they actually do. She thought about Emiko's question about needles and thread in heaven, and she made her choice. Slowly, every muscle tense, expecting a bullet. At any moment, Yuki stood. Her hand still gripped the knife under her kimono, but she stood. Every eye in the storehouse, American and Japanese, was on her. She took a step forward, then another. Her legs were shaking so badly she almost fell, but she kept walking. 5 paces to the canteen felt like 5 miles. Each step was an eternity, each breath a prayer. She knelt beside the canteen. Her hand trembled as she reached for it. The metal was warm from the sun, real, solid, not a dream or a trick. She lifted it to her lips and drank. The water was slightly metallic tasting of the canteen, but it was clean, cool, pure. It was the most beautiful thing she had tasted in days. She drank deeply, then lowered the canteen and looked up at the Marines. They had not moved. They stood exactly where they had been, weapons lowered, watching her. The tall Marine nodded once, just a small movement of his head, and there was something in his eyes, Yuki thought, something that might have been respect. She took the canteen and walked back to Amiko. Her sister grabbed it with both hands and drank desperately, water spilling down her chin. One by one, the other women approached, slowly at first, then faster. They drank. They cried as they drank, and the Marines did not move. Then more soldiers appeared carrying a wooden crate. They set it down near the storehouse entrance and backed away. The translator called out, "Food, canned food, for you, please eat." The women stared at the crate. Then one brave mother approached, opened it, and pulled out a tin can. American rations. She stared at it like she had never seen a can before. Maybe she had not. Someone found a way to open it. Inside was beef hash, cold but edible. The smell of food made everyone's stomach clench with hunger. And then they were all eating, falling on the food like animals unable to control themselves. Mothers sobbing as they fed their children. Children cramming food into their mouths with both hands. Through it all, the Marines stood at a distance, watching, making sure, but not approaching, not reaching, not taking. Yuki sat with Amiko, watching her sister eat a piece of canned peach like it was manna from heaven. And Yuki realized something that made her head spin. They are not touching us. Everything she had been told, every warning, every piece of propaganda, every fearful certainty had been about what the Americans would do to them, how they would violate, degrade, destroy. But they were not doing any of that. They were giving food and water, and they were staying away. She looked across the space at the tall Marine. He was talking quietly to one of his men, a very young soldier who appeared to be crying. The tall Marine put a hand on the young man's shoulder, said something, and the young soldier nodded. Why would he be crying, Yuki wondered. Was it shame, pity? Or was it possible that these men, these enemies, were something other than monsters? One of the women near Yuki whispered, her voice shaking. This is the trap. They make us trust them. Then they strike. But Hana's voice came from the back of the group, quiet but firm. Or it is what it appears to be. Mercy. That night, they were moved to a temporary holding area at the edge of the village. The Marines gave each woman a blanket, army-issue wool, scratchy but warm. They spread them on the ground, creating a space for the women and children to rest. The Marines set up a perimeter around this space, but their rifles were pointed outward away from the women, and their backs were turned, giving the women privacy. Yuki sat on her blanket with Amiko curled against her side. Her sister had fallen asleep almost immediately, exhausted and finally fed. But Yuki could not sleep. She watched the Marines patrol their perimeter, watched how they moved, how they talked to each other in low voices. She still had the knife hidden in her clothing, but her grip on it had loosened, just slightly. As darkness fell, one of the women approached Yuki quietly. She was young, perhaps 20, with a baby sleeping in her arms. What do we do? The woman whispered. Do we trust them? Yuki looked at her baby, then at the Marine standing guard, then back at the woman. I do not know, she said honestly, but we are alive, and our children are fed. That is more than we had this morning. The woman nodded slowly and returned to her blanket. Yuki lay back, staring up at the Pacific stars. Amiko's breathing was slow and steady beside her. Her sister was alive, fed, safe at least for tonight. In her hand, the knife felt heavier than it had that morning. Or perhaps lighter. She could not tell anymore. Somewhere across the perimeter, the tall Marine made his rounds, checking on his men. He paused near the women's area, but not too close. Never too close. He stood there for a moment, silhouetted against the starlight. Yuki watched him, and for the first time in months, she allowed herself to think a thought she had believed forbidden. Perhaps we will live through this. Perhaps the monsters were only ever in the propaganda. Perhaps courage means something other than dying. The thought terrified her more than the knife ever had. Because if the enemy was not what she had been taught, then everything else might be a lie too. And Yuki would have to face a world where nothing was certain, where honor was not what she thought, where living required more bravery than dying ever had. That was the beginning, the first crack in the wall of fear. And in the days to come, that crack would widen until the entire wall came tumbling down, revealing a truth that would change Yuki forever. But that story, the story of what happened next, would have to wait for morning. For now, there was only darkness and the sound of children sleeping peacefully for the first time in weeks. And somewhere in that darkness, an American Marine stood guard, thinking about a sister who had died at Pearl Harbor and wondering if showing mercy to her enemies was the truest way to honor her memory. The night was long, but morning would come, and with it questions that neither Yuki nor Mike could have imagined. Morning came with the smell of coffee. Yuki woke to it confused at first, her mind still fogged with exhausted sleep. The scent was rich and bitter, drifting across the temporary camp on the warm Pacific breeze. It was a smell she had only encountered once before years ago, when a visiting merchant had brought a small bag of beans to show her father. She remembered thinking it smelled like burnt earth and promises. Emiko stirred beside her, nose wrinkling. What is that? Around them, other women were waking, heads lifting from makeshift pillows, eyes blinking against the morning sun. The Marines were already awake, had probably been awake for hours. They moved around the perimeter with practiced efficiency, but quietly, as if trying not to disturb their prisoners. Their prisoners. That was what they were now. The word sat strange in Yuki's mind. Prisoners implied captivity, but the Marines had not built cages. They had not bound hands or chained ankles. The perimeter was marked only by the Marines themselves, standing at intervals, rifles pointed away. One of the younger soldiers approached the one they had seen yesterday, the translator. He stopped a respectful distance away and spoke in careful Japanese. Good morning, my name is Private Tommy Chen. I will be translating for Bowen for you. The sergeant has ordered breakfast. It will arrive soon. There are also facilities for washing. If you need anything, please tell me. Facilities for washing. Yuki almost laughed at the formal phrasing, as if they were guests at an inn rather than prisoners of war. But within the hour, the Marines had rigged up something that made several women gasp. Canvas tarps stretched between poles, creating enclosed spaces, privacy screens, and behind them barrels of water soap, even cloths for drying. For washing, Tommy Chen explained, his face slightly red with embarrassment at having to discuss such things. Private, the guards will face away. No one will look. You have my word. Hana was the first to approach the washing area. She walked with her head high, dignified, despite her torn clothing and unwashed hair. She disappeared behind the canvas. The women waited tense, expecting screams, or worse. Instead, they heard the sound of water being poured. A long silence. Then Hana emerged, her face and hands clean for the first time in weeks, her hair damp and combed back with her fingers. They kept their word, she said simply. No one looked. After that, the women went one by one. Yuki helped Emiko wash, scrubbing the grime from her sister's face until the skin underneath showed pink and healthy. The girl giggled at the sensation of being clean, and the sound was so unexpected, so purely joyful, that several women turned to stare. When had they last heard a child laugh? But the morning's greatest shock came with breakfast. The Marines brought it in on metal trays, dozens of them carried by a work detail of 6 men who moved with military precision. They set the trays down on a long table they had assembled from wooden planks and crates, then backed away to their posts. Tommy Chen gestured toward the food. Please, eat. The women approached slowly, unsure, and then they saw what was on those trays, and several of them stopped walking, entirely frozen in disbelief. Bacon. Strips of it, dozens of strips, fried until the edges crisped and curled, glistening with rendered fat. The smell hit them like a physical force. Rich, salty, smoky, intoxicating. Next to the bacon were scrambled eggs, still steaming, toast buttered and golden, small tins of fruit, and coffee, that mysterious bitter drink in metal cups. Mrs. Kimura, the elderly woman who had barely eaten anything the day before, began to cry. Just stood there looking at the food and crying, tears running down her weathered cheeks. This cannot be real, someone whispered. This is too much. This must be a dream. But it was real. The smell was too strong to be imagined. The heat rising from the food was too immediate to be fantasy. Yuki picked up a strip of bacon. It was hot enough to almost burn her fingers. She brought it to her mouth, hesitated, then bit down. The taste exploded across her tongue. Salt and fat and smoke and something else, something almost sweet in the finish. The texture was perfect, crispy on the outside, tender within. Grease coated her lips, and she did not care, could not care because she had never tasted anything so rich, so complete, so utterly satisfying. She ate 3 more strips before she remembered to breathe. Around her, other women were doing the same eating with single-minded intensity, some crying as they chewed, overcome by the simple, overwhelming fact of good food after weeks of starvation. Emiko's eyes went wide as she tasted her first bite. "Oni-chan," she said, her mouth still full. "What is this? Why does it taste so good?" Yuki did not know how to answer. She turned to Tommy Chen, who was watching from his position near the perimeter. "What is this meat?" she asked in Japanese. "Bacon," he replied, "from pigs. In America, people eat it for breakfast every day. Regular people, not just soldiers or rich people. Everyone. Every day. Regular people." The words echoed in Yuki's mind. This luxury, this incredible abundance was normal to Americans. Every day. Common. She looked down at the half-eaten strip in her hand, then at the trays still piled with food, then at the Marines, standing guard with their backs turned and their rifles pointed away. These men had given them the food they themselves ate. They had shared, not given scraps or rations meant for prisoners, but their own breakfast. American breakfast. The breakfast of regular people who ate bacon every day. The realization was dizzying. Everything they had been told about America being weak, starving, desperate, collapsing under the weight of war, all of it had been lies. You could not feed your prisoners bacon every morning if your country was starving. You could not afford such casual abundance if you were desperate. Hana approached Yuki quietly, a piece of toast in her hand. "Child," she said softly, "we were told America had nothing, that they were poor and weak, that their soldiers were starving." "I know," Yuki replied, unable to take her eyes off the food. "Do starving soldiers give away bacon?" "No," Yuki admitted, "they do not." That afternoon, they were moved to a larger camp 3 miles inland. The march was slow, accommodating the children and elderly. Marines walked ahead and behind, but again not surrounding them, not herding them like animals. Yuki carried Emiko for part of the journey. Her sister had grown heavier since yesterday, her stomach finally full, her body beginning to recover. The weight was welcome, proof of life, proof that the food had been real. As they walked, they passed through what had been the center of Garapan, or what remained of it. The destruction was total. Buildings reduced to rubble, streets cratered by bombs, the harbor twisted metal and sunken ships. Yuki's family shop had stood somewhere in this devastation. She tried to locate it by memory, by the shape of the street, but everything was too changed. The shop was gone. The Singer sewing machine was gone. The smell of fabric and machine oil was gone. Her father was gone. Everything was gone except her, Emiko, and their mother, who walked ahead with the other women, silent and withdrawn since yesterday. Private Rodriguez, the young Marine who had been crying yesterday, walked near Yuki. He noticed her staring at the ruins. "I'm sorry," he said in English. She did not understand the words, but she understood the tone. She looked at him, this boy soldier who could not be more than 19, and saw genuine sadness in his face. Why was he sad? His side had won. These ruins were his victory. Unless winning did not feel the way he had expected. Unless destroying a city, even an enemy city, carried a weight that was hard to bear. The large camp was called Camp Florence, Tommy Chen told them. It had been built quickly in the weeks since the island fell to house the growing number of civilians surrendering or being captured. Wooden barracks, neat rows of them, surrounded by barbed wire fencing that made several women gasp in fear. But Tommy was quick to explain. The wire faces out, to keep others from coming in without permission, not to keep you from leaving. It is for your protection. Protection, another strange word in this strange new reality. Inside the camp, they were separated by gender. Men mostly captured soldiers and male civilians in one section across the compound, women and children in another. The barracks were simple but clean, wooden bunks with thin mattresses, better than the ground they had been sleeping on for weeks. And in the center of the camp stood a tent marked with a red cross, a medical station. That evening, a man in an American uniform but without a rifle approached the women's section. He was older than most of the soldiers, perhaps 40, with kind eyes behind round spectacles. Tommy Chen accompanied him. "This is Captain David Eisenberg," Tommy translated. "He is a doctor. He would like to examine the children and anyone who is sick or injured. With your permission. The women drew back instinctively. A man, an American man, wanting to examine children. I will not force anyone, the doctor said through Tommy, but I have medicine, antibiotics, vitamins. Some of your children are very sick. I can help, but only if you allow it. The silence was heavy with fear and suspicion. Then Emiko coughed, a deep, rattling cough that shook her small frame. She had been coughing for days, Yuki realized with sudden horror. In all the chaos and fear, she had not paid enough attention. But now hearing it clearly, the cough sounded terrible. Wrong. Captain Eisenberg heard it too. He looked at Emiko with a doctor's trained eye, and his expression grew serious. That child needs to be examined, he said quietly to Tommy. Soon. That sounds like it could be tuberculosis or a serious lung infection. Tommy translated, and Yuki felt her heart stop. Tuberculosis, she knew that word. It was a death sentence in Japan right now, with hospitals destroyed and medicine scarce. Please, Tommy said gently, let the doctor examine her. He can help. Yuki looked at her sister who had stopped coughing, but looked exhausted from the effort. She looked at the doctor, this American enemy, who said he could help. She looked at the knife she still carried, hidden in her clothing, useless against disease. She made her choice. Yes, she said, examine her. The medical tent smelled of disinfectant and canvas. Captain Eisenberg worked efficiently but gently, listening to Emiko's lungs, with a stethoscope checking her throat and eyes, asking questions through Tommy about how long she had been coughing, whether she had fever, whether she had been exposed to anyone with tuberculosis. Yuki stayed close, watching every movement, ready to intervene if needed. But the doctor's hands were professional, impersonal. He treated Emiko like a patient, not a prisoner. Not an enemy, just a sick child who needed help. After 10 minutes, he stepped back and removed his stethoscope. Not tuberculosis, he said, and Yuki felt her legs go weak with relief. Bronchitis, a lung infection but treatable. I will give you medicine. Sulfanilamide tablets. 3 times a day, with food for 10 days. She should recover fully. He prepared a small bottle of tablets, wrote instructions in Japanese characters with careful precision, and handed both to Yuki. Keep her warm, make sure she eats. Give the medicine exactly as written. She will get better. Yuki took the medicine with shaking hands. Why, she asked. The word came out before she could stop it. Why do you help her? Captain Eisenberg looked at her for a long moment. Then he said through Tommy, because I am a doctor, and she is a child. Those are the only things that matter. That night back in the barracks, Yuki gave Emiko her first dose of medicine. The girl made a face at the bitter taste but swallowed it. Within hours, her coughing had eased. By morning, she was breathing more easily than she had in days. Around them, other women whispered. Mrs. Kimura's infected wound had been cleaned and bandaged. A pregnant woman had been given vitamins and instructions for care. An elderly woman with chronic pain had received aspirin, all free, all without condition, all from the enemy. Hana sat beside Yuki on one of the bunks watching Emiko sleep peacefully. My grandmother told me, Hana said softly, that you judge people by how they treat those who cannot help them in return. These Americans gain nothing from healing our children. We have nothing to offer them. No strategic value, no military intelligence. We are just hungry, sick civilians. I know, Yuki whispered, yet they heal us anyway. I know. What does that tell you, child? Yuki was silent for a long time, watching her sister breathe easily, the medicine working its miracle inside her small body. It tells me, she finally said, that I do not understand anything anymore. I was prepared to die hating them. I had made peace with that. But how can I hate men who saved my sister's life? Hana reached out and patted Yuki's hand. Perhaps hate was always easier than understanding. Hate is simple, understanding is hard. But understanding was getting harder to avoid. Every day brought new evidence that contradicted everything Yuki had been taught. The Marines maintained their distance. They never entered the women's barracks without announcing themselves first. They never touched the women. When distributing food or supplies, they set items down and stepped back, always maintaining that invisible boundary. One evening as the sun set over the camp, Yuki stood near the fence, watching the Marines change their guard shifts. She noticed one particular sergeant, the tall one who had first entered the storehouse. He was making rounds checking on his men, stopping to speak with each one. When he reached Tommy Chen's post, he stopped longer. Yuki was close enough to hear them talking, though she could not understand the English words. But she could hear the tones. Tommy sounded frustrated, upset. The sergeant's voice was calm, measured. Tommy's voice rose slightly, still respectful but emotional. The sergeant put a hand on his shoulder, said something that made Tommy nod slowly. Later, when Tommy came to deliver the evening meal, Yuki approached him. "Private Chen," she said carefully, "may I ask a question?" "Of course, Val." "The tall sergeant, the one who found us first. What is his name?" "Sergeant Michael O'Brien. We call him Mike. He is a good man." "He seems sad sometimes." Tommy was quiet for a moment, as if deciding how much to say. Then he spoke, his voice soft. "He lost his sister at Pearl Harbor. She was a Navy nurse on a hospital ship. She died in the attack." The words hit Yuki like a physical blow. His sister, killed by Japanese forces, by her countrymen. "But she struggled to find words. He treats us with respect, even though we killed his sister," Tommy finished gently. "Yes, that is who Sergeant O'Brien is. He believes that becoming like the enemy means the enemy has won. He believes that mercy is not weakness, that how we treat prisoners says more about us than it does about them." Yuki looked across the camp to where Sergeant O'Brien stood talking to another Marine. He looked tired. They all looked tired. But his shoulders were straight, his bearing disciplined. He had every reason to hate her people, to take revenge, to make them suffer as he had suffered. Instead, he had given them water, food, medicine, respect. "I do not understand him," Yuki admitted. "I am not sure I do either," Tommy said, "but I am trying to learn from him." The following morning brought a small miracle. Mail call. A Red Cross worker arrived at the camp with papers, forms, and a translator. An announcement was made. Prisoners could write letters to family members in Japan. The Red Cross would attempt to deliver them. No guarantees, but they would try. The women stared in disbelief. Letters. They could write home, tell their families they were alive. Yuki's hands shook as she accepted paper and a pencil. She sat on her bunk for an hour, staring at the blank page, trying to decide what to write. How could she explain this? How could she tell her mother, if her mother still lived, that she was a prisoner, but that she was being treated well, that the enemy fed them bacon for breakfast and healed their children and turned their backs to give them privacy? Who would believe such a story? But she had to try. Her mother might be waiting, hoping, praying for any word. Even a word that made no sense was better than silence. She began to write her characters, careful and precise. "Honorable Mother, if this reaches, you know that Emiko and I live. We are prisoners of Americans on Saipan. I must tell you something you will not believe. They do not harm us. We are fed better than we ate in the final months of war. Emiko's cough is treated by their doctor. We sleep in barracks with roofs and blankets. The soldiers do not touch us. They keep their distance and turn their backs to protect our privacy. I know what you were told. I know what I believed. But Mother, it is not true. They are not demons. I do not understand this. I thought I would die in shame. Instead, I live in confusion. Perhaps confusion is better than death. I hope you receive this. I hope you live. If you do, perhaps one day I can explain what I cannot explain even to myself. Your daughter, Yuki." She folded the letter carefully, as if it were something precious, as if it were a message in a bottle cast into an infinite ocean, hoping against hope to reach shore. 3 weeks passed. The routine of camp life became familiar. Breakfast at 7, medical checks at 9, free time in the courtyard at 2, dinner at 6, lights out at 8. Emiko's cough disappeared completely. Her cheeks filled out. She began to play with other children in the courtyard, their laughter ringing across the camp like bells. Yuki found herself watching the Marines more carefully, learning their patterns, their personalities. Private Rodriguez, who always looked sad but tried to smile at the children. Corporal Jackson, who sang while he worked. Private Murphy, who was clumsy but earnest. And Sergeant O'Brien, who never seemed to rest, who checked on his men constantly, who stood watch in the quiet hours when he thought no one was looking. One afternoon, Rodriguez approached the fence near where Yuki stood. He pulled something from his pocket, a photograph. He held it up for her to see, pointing to himself, then to the photo. Yuki stepped closer. The photograph showed a family. A woman who must be Rodriguez's mother. Three young girls, all smiling, all with Rodriguez's same dark eyes. He pointed to the girls, then to Amico playing in the courtyard. Hermanas, he said, a Spanish word, but the meaning was clear from his gesture. Sisters. He pointed to Amico again, then to the girls in the photo, then to his own heart. Yuki understood. He was saying that he saw his sisters in Amico, that these children reminded him of his own family, that they were human to him, not just enemy prisoners. She did not know the English words to respond, but she bowed slightly, a gesture of acknowledgement. Rodriguez smiled, a real smile this time, and returned the bow clumsily. That evening, Yuki realized something that shocked her. She had smiled at an American soldier, a tiny smile, barely there, but real. And it had not felt like betrayal. It had felt like recognition. Human to human, the world was changing. Or perhaps the world had always been this way, and only her understanding was changing. On day 17, something happened that tested everything. It was after dark. Most of the women were preparing for sleep when they heard shouting, male voices angry and slurred. A commotion near the perimeter. The women froze. This was it, the moment they had been waiting for, the moment when the restraint would break and the truth would emerge. Through the windows, they could see a Marine stumbling toward their barracks. He was clearly drunk, barely able to walk straight. He was shouting something, gesturing wildly. Terror returned in an instant. Yuki grabbed her knife, moved to stand between the approaching drunk and her sister. Other women grabbed their children, pressed themselves against the far wall. But before the drunk Marine could get within 50 feet of the barracks, a shadow moved. Fast. Efficient. Sergeant O'Brien appeared from somewhere running and tackled the drunk man to the ground. Hard. The drunk hit the earth with a sound that could be heard clearly inside the barracks. O'Brien's voice cut through the night, sharp and furious. You take one more step toward that barracks, and I will end your career and your freedom. Do you understand me, Private? The drunk mumbled something. I said, do you understand me? Yes, sir. Two more Marines appeared and dragged the drunk away. O'Brien stood there for a moment, breathing hard, staring after them. Then he turned toward the women's barracks. He did not approach. He just stood there, visible in the moonlight, and called out, Tommy, get over here. Tommy Chen ran up and O'Brien said something to him. Tommy called toward the barracks in Japanese. Sergeant O'Brien says the man will be court-martialed tomorrow. He says he apologizes. He says you are under his protection and anyone who violates that will face military justice. He asked if anyone was hurt. Silence from the barracks. Then Hana's voice, steady and clear. Tell the sergeant no one was hurt. Tell him we are grateful for his protection. Tommy translated. O'Brien nodded once, sharp and military, then returned to his rounds. Inside the barracks, the women slowly released breaths they had not realized they were holding. He fought his own man for us, Mrs. Kimura whispered. He protected us from his own soldier. He meant it, another woman said, wonder in her voice. All of it. He meant it. Yuki sat on her bunk, still gripping the knife, but her hand was trembling now for a different reason. Not fear. Something else. Something she did not have words for yet. He had protected them. Not because he had to. Not because of orders, though orders might have played a part, but because he had given his word, and his word meant something. The next morning, the drunk Marine was gone, transferred to the stockade pending court-martial. Tommy confirmed it quietly, justice swift and certain. That afternoon, a miracle arrived. The Red Cross worker returned with a canvas bag of letters. Responses. From Japan. From families who had received the prisoners' letters and sent replies. One by one, names were called. One by one, women received thin envelopes, their hands shaking as they opened them. Tanaka Yuki. Yuki stood, her heart pounding so hard she could barely hear. She walked forward, accepted the envelope, and returned to her bunk before opening it. Inside, her mother's handwriting. Shaky, uncertain, but recognizable. Yuki-chan, I thought you dead. Your words bring me joy and fear. Joy that you live. Fear because I do not know if I should believe what you say. The government says Americans lie, that prisoners are forced to write false letters. But you use the phrase grandmother's crane. Only you would know that phrase from our family. So I believe you. I believe my daughter lives. And I believe something impossible, that enemies can act like humans. Japan has surrendered. The emperor has spoken. The war is over. Perhaps now mercy is possible. Come home when they allow, I will wait. Mother. The war was over. Japan had surrendered, and her mother was alive waiting for her. Yuki read the letter 3 times, then pressed it to her chest and wept. Around her, other women were crying too, clutching their own letters, their own impossible confirmations of life, continuing despite war. Hana found Yuki in the courtyard an hour later, still holding the letter. Your mother lives. Yes, and she believes me. She believes what I wrote about the Americans. A wise woman. She said the war is over. Yes, we heard. Japan has surrendered. Soon they say we will be sent home. Home, the word felt strange. What home? The shop was destroyed. The village was gone. Her father was dead. What remained to return to except her mother and memories? But Emiko would have a home. Emiko would have a life. That was worth everything. That evening, Sergeant O'Brien allowed Tommy Chen to bring something special to the women's barracks. 6 bottles of Coca-Cola, carefully rationed from the Marines' personal supplies. A celebration, Tommy explained. The war is over. You will go home soon. The sergeant thought you might like to try this. It is very American. The women gathered around as Tommy opened the bottles. The hiss of carbonation, the sweet smell, the dark mystery of the liquid. Yuki took a bottle and sipped carefully. The sensation was extraordinary. Bubbles tingling on her tongue, sweetness like nothing she had ever tasted, a slight bitterness underneath. Cold and refreshing and strange and wonderful. Emiko tried it and giggled at the fizz. Other women smiled, actually smiled at the unexpected pleasure of this foreign drink. Yuki looked at the Coca-Cola bottle in her hand, at the English words on the label she could not read, at this small piece of American life they had been given to share. And she understood finally what Sergeant O'Brien had been trying to show them all along. That enemies could share something sweet. That mercy was possible even in war. That the distance between human beings was not as vast as propaganda made it seem. She kept the empty bottle cleaned and dried, tucked carefully into her few belongings. A reminder, a proof, a witness to the impossible thing that had happened here. Tomorrow they would begin preparing for the journey home. But tonight there was Coca-Cola and laughter and the knowledge that they had survived. Not just survived physically, but survived with their humanity intact. And so had their captors. In the morning, Yuki would wake to find that the world had shifted again. That going home would be harder than she imagined. That carrying the truth would be a burden all its own. But tonight there was only the taste of something sweet and the sound of her sister laughing and the quiet pride of knowing that she had chosen to live and that choice had been the right one, even if no one back home would ever truly understand. The boat ride home should have felt like freedom. Instead, it felt like carrying a secret too heavy to bear. Yuki stood on the deck of the transport ship, watching the gray waters of the Pacific roll beneath them. Around her, other women from Camp Florence huddled together, some clutching the few belongings they had been allowed to keep. Small bundles of clothes, letters from families, and in Yuki's case, an empty Coca-Cola bottle wrapped carefully in cloth. The American sailors on the ship maintained the same respectful distance the Marines had kept. They provided food, water, blankets. They spoke little and touched less. The pattern continued even here, even in transit, even when the women were no longer under guard, but simply passengers being returned to what remained of their country. Emiko leaned against the railing beside Yuki, her color fully returned, now her cough completely gone. She looked healthy, more than healthy. She looked like a child who had been cared for, fed, protected. The evidence of American mercy was written on her body in every ounce of recovered weight, every easy breath. Oni-chan, Emiko said quietly, what will we tell people about what happened? Yuki had been asking herself the same question for days. The truth, yeah. Will they believe us? That was the question that kept Yuki awake at night. I don't know. Behind them, Mrs. Kimura was speaking with another woman, her voice low, but carrying in the ocean air. When we arrive, we must be careful what we say. People will not understand. They will think we are traitors or collaborators. But we did nothing wrong, the other woman protested. We were prisoners. We had no choice. We had the choice to die, Mrs. Kimura said flatly. Many did. We chose to live. Some will say that was the wrong choice. Hana joined Yuki at the railing, her silver-streaked hair pulled back with a strip of cloth. She looked older than she had at Camp Florence, as if the prospect of return had aged her. You are quiet, child. I am thinking about what comes next. Wise to think ahead. Hana pulled out her grandmother's rosary, the beads catching the weak sunlight. I have been praying for wisdom to know what to say, for courage to speak truth, even when truth is unwelcome. Do you think they will call us liars? Some will. Others will call all us worse. Hana fingered the beads thoughtfully. But I will not lie to make them comfortable. My grandmother hid her faith for decades because the truth was dangerous. I will not hide my. The Americans showed us mercy. That is fact. Facts do not change because they are inconvenient. The voyage lasted 3 days. Each day the women grew more anxious, more uncertain. They were going home, but home was not what they had left. Japan had surrendered. The emperor himself had spoken on the radio, his voice thin and metallic, acknowledging defeat. The unthinkable had happened. What kind of country would they be returning to? On the morning of the third day, land appeared on the horizon, the coast of Honshu misty in the dawn light. As the ship drew closer, the devastation became visible. The harbor was choked with sunken ships, their masts jutting from the water like tombstones. The city beyond was a landscape of ruins, buildings reduced to skeletal frames, streets barely visible under rubble, smoke still rising from fires that must have burned for days or weeks. Yuki heard someone behind her begin to cry, then another. Soon half the women on deck were weeping, seeing for the first time what defeat looked like in concrete terms. This was what they were returning to. This wasteland, this graveyard of a nation. The ship docked in Yokohama Harbor. American soldiers and Japanese officials under occupation authority processed the returning prisoners. Forms were filled out, names were recorded. Destinations were noted, though many women had no destination to give. Their homes were gone, their families scattered or dead. Yuki gave her home prefecture, not knowing if her mother still lived there, not knowing if anything remained. But it was all she had. They were loaded onto trains. The rail system was barely functioning, but the Americans had repaired enough track to move people. The train cars were crowded, filled with refugees and displaced persons and returning prisoners, all trying to get somewhere that might still exist. Through the window, Yuki watched the Japanese countryside roll past. Fields lay untended. Villages were abandoned. In the distance, she could see what had been a city, now just a dark stain on the landscape. Which city, impossible to tell. They all looked the same now, just shadows of what they had been. Emiko pressed her face to the window. Everything is broken. Yes. Will we be able to fix it? Yuki did not have an answer for that. The train ride took a full day, stopping and starting, delayed by damaged track and overcrowding. When they finally reached the station nearest to their home district, Yuki and Emiko disembarked with their mother, who had barely spoken since leaving Saipan. Their mother had grown more withdrawn as they traveled. She clutched her bundle of belongings and stared straight ahead, her face expressionless. Yuki worried about Ursula. The woman who had pressed a knife into her daughter's hand and whispered about honor seemed to have hollowed out, leaving only a shell. They walked from the station toward where their home had been. The walk that should have taken 30 minutes took 2 hours because the streets were so damaged. They had to climb over rubble, navigate around craters, detour where entire blocks had been reduced to ash. Finally, they reached the neighborhood, or what had been the neighborhood. Yuki recognized nothing. The landmarks she had used her entire life were gone. The corner shop where they bought rice, the temple with the stone garden, the old tree where children played. All gone. Where their house had stood, there was only a cleared space and a makeshift shelter. Wooden planks and salvaged metal formed a structure barely large enough for 2 people to sleep in. And standing in front of that shelter, so thin she looked like she might blow away in the wind, was their mother. Their actual mother. The woman who had stayed behind when they fled to Saipan with their father. She saw them and froze. For a moment, nobody moved. Then she ran, stumbling over broken ground, and caught Emiko in her arms. She was sobbing, a sound like something breaking and healing at the same time. "I thought you dead," she gasped. "I thought you both dead." She pulled Yuki into the embrace, and for a long moment they just stood there, 3 women reunited in the ruins, holding each other as if letting go would make them disappear again. Eventually they moved into the shelter. It was cramped, barely weatherproof, but it was theirs. Their mother had been living there alone for months, surviving on occupation rations and what little work she could find, doing mending for people who still had clothes worth mending. That night, by the light of a single candle, their mother asked the question Yuki had been dreading. Tell me truly, what did they do to you? Yuki looked at her mother's haunted face, at Emiko sleeping peacefully in the corner, at the shadows dancing on the shelter walls. And she told the truth. All of it. The fear in the storehouse, the Marines with their lowered rifles, the water and food, the camp, the medical care, the bacon breakfasts, the Coca-Cola, the doctor who healed Emiko, Sergeant O'Brien who protected them from his own drunken soldier. She told it all, watching her mother's face cycle through disbelief, confusion, and something that might have been grief. When Yuki finished, her mother was silent for a long time. Then she spoke, her voice breaking. I told you to die rather than be dishonored. I pressed a knife into your hand. I told you death was better than capture. Yes, you disobeyed me. Yes. Her mother looked at Emiko sleeping peacefully, her chest rising and falling with easy breaths that would not have been possible without American medicine. Thank the gods you disobeyed me, her mother whispered. Thank the gods you were braver than I was. I would have killed my own daughters for honor, and you saved them for love. She reached out and gripped Yuki's hand, her fingers thin and cold. I am sorry, Yuki-chan. I am sorry I told you to value death over life. I am sorry I believed the lies. Your father made me promise before he died in the bombing. He said, if the girls survive, don't let hate poison them. I failed that promise. But you did not. I am proud of you. Yuki felt something break open inside her chest. Relief, perhaps? Or forgiveness? Or simply the end of a terrible weight she had been carrying since the storehouse. The days that followed were harder in different ways. Neighbors began to hear their story. Word spread, and with the word came judgment. Some refused to believe it. You lie, an old man spat at Yuki in the street. Americans are beasts. You were a comfort woman, and now you lie to hide your shame. Others believed but condemned anyway. You should have died, a woman said coldly. Better dead than accepting their charity. Yuki tried to defend herself, to explain, to show the evidence. She had the letters. She had the Coca-Cola bottle. She had Emiko alive and healthy when she should have been dead. But evidence did not change minds that were determined not to change. Hana visited when she could. She lived in a similar shelter 2 districts over, and she faced similar accusations. But she remained defiant. I told my family the truth, she said. Some believe, some do not. But I will not be silent about mercy. Too many died because of lies. Truth must live, even if it is uncomfortable. Weeks passed, then months. Yuki found work, as did her mother. They sewed, mended, slowly rebuilt a tiny version of what their shop had been. Emiko attended a makeshift school that had been set up in a damaged temple. Life continued, but the story continued with it. Then 2 months after their return, a package arrived. It came through the Red Cross, forwarded through official channels. A small box wrapped in brown paper addressed to Miss Tanaka, Yuki, Saipan, prisoner, Japan. Yuki opened it with shaking hands. Inside was a sewing kit. Not a military field kit, but a proper civilian sewing kit. Good scissors, a variety of needles, thread in multiple colors, a small pincushion in the shape of a tomato. There was also a photograph. It showed Sergeant O'Brien, Private Rodriguez, Tommy Chen, and other Marines from Camp Florence, all standing in front of the camp gate, smiling into the camera. On the back, each had signed his name, and there was a letter, written in English, with a Japanese translation attached in Tommy Chen's careful handwriting. Miss Tanaka, I heard through Red Cross channels that you made it home safely. I am glad. My mother, when I told her about you and your sister, sent this sewing kit from our home in Savannah, Georgia. She said every young woman should have tools to build a new life. I do not know if you still sew after everything that happened, but if you do, maybe this helps. Also included is a photo of me and my unit. Private Rodriguez especially wanted you to have it. He remembers your sister's laugh. We all remember you, all of you. The women and children of Camp Florence taught us something important, that the truest test of character is how you treat people who cannot fight back. You could not fight back. We chose to treat you with dignity anyway. I hope we succeeded. I hope Japan heals quickly. I hope you find peace. I hope the world we are building now is better than the one we just tore apart. If you ever come to America, my door is open. With respect and gratitude, Semper Fi, Always faithful, Sergeant Michael O'Brien, USMC. Yuki read the letter 3 times. Then she showed it to her mother, who read it and wept. He sent his mother's sewing kit, her mother whispered. He remembered you months later and sent his mother's tools. Yuki placed the photograph next to the Coca-Cola bottle on the small shelf in their shelter. Evidence, proof, a reminder that the impossible had happened and been real. She began sewing again using the American tools. Small items at first, repairs for neighbors, then simple garments. Her reputation grew not despite the story of her captivity, but in some circles because of it. Some customers specifically sought her out because they had heard she had been treated well by Americans, and they took that as a sign that maybe, just maybe, the occupation would not be as terrible as they feared. The years passed in the way years do when you are rebuilding from nothing, slowly, painfully, with small victories and frequent setbacks. Emiko grew. She married at 20, had children, told them the story of the American Marines who had saved their grandmother's life. Yuki never married. She focused on her work on rebuilding the shop, on caring for her mother in her declining years. The shop grew from a shelter to a real building, small but solid. Tanaka family tailoring the sign read again, a resurrection. She kept the Coca-Cola bottle on a shelf where customers could see it. Some asked about it. She told them the story. Some believed. Some did not. She told it anyway. 15 years after the war, something remarkable happened. An American man entered her shop. He was about 40, dressed in business clothes, clearly a tourist or businessman. He looked around the small space with interest, then noticed the photograph on the wall. The Marines at Camp Florence. "Excuse me," he said in English, then tried again in broken Japanese. "That photo, may I ask about it?" Yuki came forward, her English much improved after years of dealing with occupation forces and later with American businessmen. "It is from the war," she said carefully. "I was a prisoner. These men were my guards." The man looked closer at the photo, then at her, astonishment on his face. "You keep a photo of the men who captured you." "They captured me," Yuki agreed, "but they did not harm me. They fed me, healed my sister, protected us, showed mercy when they had every reason to show cruelty." She told him the story, a condensed version. The man listened with growing emotion. "Ma'am," he said, when she finished, "I am a Marine veteran myself, served in Korea, but I never thought about what happened to prisoners. I just knew we won." "You won the war," Yuki said, "but men like Sergeant O'Brien won something more. They won honor. They proved that victory does not require cruelty." The man was quiet for a moment. "What happened to Sergeant O'Brien, do you know?" "No, the Red Cross lost track of him after 1946. I hope he lives well. I hope he knows that what he did mattered." The man surprised her then. "Ma'am, would you be willing to write this down for the Marine Corps Historical Archives? I think people need to hear this story. Americans need to know what our best men did. Japanese need to know not all occupiers are tyrants." Yuki hesitated. "I am not a writer." "You do not need to be. Just tell it like you told me. The truth is enough." So she did. Over several weeks, she wrote out her account in Japanese, had it translated, and submitted it to the Marine Corps Historical Division. It was archived, filed away, largely forgotten in the complexity of post-war documentation. But the act of writing it had been important. It made the memory official, real, preserved. 25 more years passed. Japan's economic miracle transformed the nation. The ruins became cities again. Poverty became prosperity. The generation that remembered the war grew old. Yuki was 58 when the second letter arrived from America. She almost did not believe it was real. The return address said Savannah, Georgia. The name was Michael O'Brien. Her hand shook as she opened it. "Dear Miss Tanaka, you likely do not remember me. I was a sergeant in the Marines on Saipan in 1945. I was one of the guards at Camp Florence. My unit recently had a reunion, and someone mentioned that the Marine Corps archives contained a testimony from a former prisoner. I requested a copy. I read it. I knew immediately it was you. You mentioned your sister, Emiko. The sewing, the letter from your mother. Miss Tanaka, I am 66 years old now. I came home from the war, married, had 3 daughters. I worked tobacco farms and then taught history at a high school for 25 years. I told my students about the war, but I never forgot you and the other women. You taught me something I could not learn in boot camp, that the truest test of character is how you treat people who cannot fight back. I am writing because I wanted you to know that you changed my life too. Seeing your courage, your dignity in captivity, your determination to keep your sister alive despite everything, it made me a better man. I tried to raise my daughters to have your strength. I tried to teach my students to see the humanity in their enemies. Thank you for writing your story. Thank you for remembering us kindly even though we were your captors. I hope your life has been full. I hope your sister as well. If you would be willing to write back, I would be honored to hear from you. I am planning a business trip to Tokyo next spring. If you would allow it, I would like to visit, to meet again, to thank you properly for the lesson you taught me all those years ago. With deep respect and gratitude, Mike O'Brien. Yuki sat in her shop now, comfortably furnished, successful by any measure. She held the letter and cried, not from sadness, but from the sheer overwhelming weight of connection. 40 years. He had remembered for 40 years. She wrote back immediately. Yes, please come. I would be honored to see you again. Spring came, and with it, Michael O'Brien. He was older, his hair gray, his face lined with age, but his eyes were the same, kind, tired, human. They met in her shop. He looked around, taking in the success she had built, and smiled. You kept it, he said, pointing to the Coca-Cola bottle on the shelf. Every day I look at it, Yuki replied in English. It reminds me that monsters have faces, and faces have stories. You kept the sewing kit, too. He had noticed it in a place of honor behind the counter. Your mother's gift. It helped me build this. She gestured to the shop. They talked for hours about the war, about their lives after, about Emiko, who was now a grandmother herself, about Mike's daughters, and all grown, all successful. Eventually, Mike pulled out a photograph. I want to show you something. It was a picture of a young woman in a Navy nurse uniform, pretty, smiling. My sister Sarah. She died at Pearl Harbor. She was the reason I almost did not show you mercy at Camp Florence. And she was the reason I did show mercy, because I knew what she would have wanted. Yuki took the photo gently. She was beautiful. She was kind, like you. I think she would have liked you. I would have liked her too. Mike met Emiko that evening. She came to the shop with her two grandchildren, teenagers now. Mike knelt down to their level, showed them the old photograph of Camp Florence, pointed himself out. Your great-aunt saved my soul, he told them in careful Japanese. She taught me that enemies are just people on the other side of lies. That took more courage than any battle I fought. As the sun set over Tokyo, no longer in ruins but gleaming with prosperity, Yuki and Mike sat together in the shop. A small refrigerator in the corner hummed quietly. Mike had noticed it. Do you have any Coca-Cola? He asked with a slight smile. Yuki laughed. She opened the refrigerator and pulled out two cold bottles. Glass bottles like the ones from Camp Florence. She opened both with a bottle opener kept specifically for this purpose. The hiss of carbonation, the sweet smell, the cold condensation on the glass. They raised their bottles in a silent toast. To mercy, Mike said. To understanding, Yuki replied. They drank together, American and Japanese captor and captive, two people who had been enemies and had become witnesses to each other's humanity. The Coca-Cola tasted the same as it had 40 years ago. Sweet, strange, wonderful. A small piece of shared experience that transcended everything that had tried to keep them apart. That night, after Mike had returned to his hotel, Yuki sat alone in her shop. The empty Coca-Cola bottle from their reunion sat next to the one from Camp Florence. Two bottles, two moments separated by 4 decades, connected by a simple truth. That mercy is stronger than cruelty. That honor exists even in war. That enemies can share something sweet, and in sharing it become something other than enemies. Not friends exactly. The distance of experience and culture and history was too vast for that. But something. Witnesses to each other's humanity. Testaments to the possibility that even in the darkest times, people can choose to be better than their circumstances demand. Yuki died in 2019 at the age of 92. Her granddaughter inherited the shop and with it 2 Coca-Cola bottles carefully preserved. She keeps them on a shelf where customers can see them. Sometimes people ask about them, and when they do, she tells a story her grandmother told her. about fear and mercy, about propaganda, and truth about a young woman who chose to live when death was expected, and about the American soldiers who chose restraint when cruelty was permitted. She tells them that one bottle came from 1945, from a day when her grandmother tasted Coca-Cola for the first time and realized that everything she had been taught about the enemy was a lie. And she tells them that the other bottle came from 1985, when her grandmother and her former captors sat together as equals and drank to the memory of a moment when mercy had mattered more than victory. The bottles remain there, two pieces of curved glass holding nothing but air and memory. But in a world that still teaches people to fear those who are different, to hate those who are other, to believe that enemies are monsters rather than humans on the wrong side of lies. Perhaps memory is the most important thing of all, because Yuki learned something in that storehouse on Saipan, something in the months at Camp Florence, something that took her 40 years to fully understand. That the truest courage is not knowing when to die, it is knowing when to live. And sometimes the greatest victory is not defeating your enemy, but recognizing that your enemy was never truly your enemy at all, just another human being trying to survive a war. Neither of you started in a world that insisted you be monsters to each other. Mike and Yuki proved that world wrong, and their proof sits on a shelf in Tokyo in two empty Coca-Cola bottles that once held something sweet.